Thank you, Deborah. That was really, really interesting and obviously very close to our hearts as educators of advanced practice. And you've raised a load of ideas in my head and loads of questions in my head. However, I will hand over to our wonderful delegates this morning and Colette for the first question. Thank you.
Okay.
Thanks, Anna. So some of the challenges are around mapping capabilities when moving roles that you're an expert in to become a novice again. Do you have
Mm-hmm.
any advice or guidance?
So in the guidance that we put together for Health Education England, we talk about developing fundamentals of supervision. And the first one of those fundamentals is the practice context. So what I encourage people to do, and what we've encouraged in that document, is to really go back and look at what are the cohorts of patients in that practice context. What do they need at an advanced level? And actually move away from the starting point being looking at the other professionals who work in that practice setting and thinking, oh, what are they doing? But actually really focus on the cohorts of patients and what they need. And there are some ideas in the appendices of that document about how you might go about doing that. So starting with your cohorts of patients, understanding what the practice context is, and then thinking about to what extent do we need competence to meet those needs, and to what extent do we need capability? So and obviously some of that work is being done because across the nations, and I know internationally, there are lots of work going on to create credentials around particular practice areas. But where you don't have that, that's my call, is to encourage you to go back to the patient cohorts and think about what they need.
Thanks, Deborah. So next question is, I like the idea of supervision being a safe place. Do you have any advice on how to ensure this is protected?
So in the UK, we talk about job planning, and our medical colleagues have job plans, and that sets out what they are expected to do within their role. And our medical colleagues are ahead of us on this, and I don't think we should be dispirited about that. I mean, in the UK, they have a guide for their training called the Gold Guide. It's in its 8th edition now, so we know we're going to have iterations of this, and we should be encouraged by that. But they have enshrined in their job plans time for supervision, and that's for the trainees and for the supervisors. So I think, and I think it's about us talking to our employers about their responsibility to us as employees, which is in the UK, that is a responsibility that they have to ensure their workforce is safe. So supervision is that obvious place to ensure that sanctuary and that meta practice is happening, and it's a crucial part of governance. So employers need to take that really seriously, and it needs to be enshrined in job descriptions and job plans, in my view. It's our best bet for a safer workforce and safer public. So we shouldn't underestimate the value of it.
I agree, Deborah, and I think your comparisons with other professions there is quite profound. Do you think that we are too risk averse as professions potentially, and that we don't allow ourselves to make mistakes when developing ideas for using the different pillars?
Well, I think this is back to the inevitability of uncertainty. And I think COVID has kind of reminded us that there is masses of uncertainty out there in practice. And again, I think our medical colleagues are, and I was at a presentation earlier this week where medical colleagues were talking about the inevitability of uncertainty in practice. I think it's shifting in medicine too. We are up against some challenges in that there is a risk focus very often in our practice settings. So we're trying to navigate that need to recognise uncertainty, the need to be able to push boundaries in order to learn, and that involves making some mistakes, but also keeping people safe. I'm going to quote, and I think that's where the permeability comes in. Actually, I think where that awareness, self-awareness comes in, and I'm going to quote a nurse, advanced practitioner who's a nurse who works in emergency medicine, who I once heard say she thought she was a very open and approachable supervisor. And then she overheard someone describing her as scary. And she realized that there were moments when she really had to kind of step in the interests of both the professionals' safety, the trainees' professional safety, and the public safety. And so now she has a phrase that she uses when she's doing her induction with people to say, okay, so I'm your supervisor and this is how I like to go about it. And I will try to be, I want to be approachable. I want you to feel you can trust me and you can bring your concerns to me. There will be times when I might have to step in, but I want to reassure you there have always been moments for all of us when we wanted to be sick on our shoes. And I think it's just such a genius description because it shows her vulnerability and it shows us that there will be uncertainties and there will be moments when things don't go as planned. So I do think we have to weave more of that actually into our pre-registration education, because it's when we come out of pre-registration, which is so criterion referenced and such a tight curriculum, that I think our newly qualified folk join the professions thinking, and maybe this will change with COVID because we're going to have cohorts now who've only ever known a COVID era, but a bit of a sense of there will be certainty when I get into practice. When I get my badge, I'll feel certain. And I think we have to be more open about the fact that that's unrealistic.
Yeah, I agree with needing to ensure that we have that strong, robust link between undergraduate and postgraduate education as well. I think that's really important, Deborah. So we have another question here now from Gillian. Should we be building in action learning alongside supervision?
Okay, so I think the action learning approach is a really interesting one. I think, like with any approach, so supervision for me is an umbrella where we might be doing lots of different things, and that supervisory relationship isn't a linear thing. So very often the supervisor will know they're not the best match for that individual's learning needs, but they might be helping that individual to navigate and decide what the learning approach should be. And it might be that we think around some things action learning is a good fit. What I do think, and there's some papers that describe how action learning initiatives sometimes falter because it feels like too much commitment. But in the business world, I've seen some papers around drop-in action learning, and I've seen some healthcare papers that talk about how if you upskill people in the philosophy and the questioning approach of action learning, that filters into the culture. So I think there are ways of using the action learning philosophy, the idea that learning, so Reg Revens talks about learning starts from not knowing. And Reg Revens, I'm going to go off on a little bit of a tangent here, but he was an astrophysicist at the Cavendish laboratories in Cambridge at times when Rutherford was there deciding that the atom was not a plum pudding with electrons embedded in it, but had a nucleus and the electrons whizzing around it. So someone really on top of their game, and a big-brained person. But what Revan started to notice was how these incredibly experienced people were really good at owning up to when they didn't know. And that was the foundation of action learning. So I think some of the principles of action learning, we're not great at that in health, owning up to when we don't know. And he also talks about learning being your program knowledge plus your questioning insight. Again, I think that's really helpful philosophy for us to bring to healthcare, because it's not just our knowledge, but it's what we do with our knowledge. And that important thing that I spoke about in the presentation about knowledge, know-how, and knowing how to be. So I've kind of gone off on a little bit of a tangent there, but I guess I'm saying I think action learning as an approach, and there will be other approaches, does have something to offer. I don't think it's an either or. It's about matching the learning activity to the learning need.
Absolutely, absolutely. We've got a whole load more questions coming in, Debs. So if you'd bear with us at the moment,
Yeah, no, doing my best,
there's
being my
one.
most permeable self.
Oh, yeah, fantastic, absolutely fantastic. So we've got a question here from Phyllis about how do we encourage individuality and accept that not all answers come easily and are not prescriptive.
Yeah. I do think we need to explore. We need to encourage experimentation. This is back to this little mantra I have that being a supervisor is not about creating a mini me. So I do think that's about supervisors being permeable enough and educators being permeable enough to know that there might be alternatives that they haven't thought about, that are clear. So moving from so focusing on your duty of care to that individual to be a safe professional and to keep the public safe, but not your duty of care to that individual is not to craft them as you. So I do think that's partly about supervisor permeability. And then the other thing I would say is that we don't spend enough time in supervision thinking about what's working well. So if I think we can we can promote some of that individuality by ensuring that the individual has the opportunity to tell you about the things that are starting to land well for them, how they got good at that stuff. That how they got good at that stuff might not be how you anticipated they got good at that stuff. So it's about us being a little bit more experimental. I love George Kelly's personal construct ideas. And he talks about person as scientist. And I think we do need to have some of those little experiments. He also says, we don't need to be a victim of our own biography. So just because I learned this thing this way, doesn't mean that's the only way I can ever learn. So I think it is about encouraging a bit of experimentation. I often say my kids thankfully through all of this now, but when they were doing exams, you'd find them writing their exam revision timetable, and then they'd go out to the park and they'd miss something out of their timetable. They'd recraft a timetable from the beginning again, because that's what they knew to do. And I often said to them, question 1 is not going to be, please draw your exam revision timetable. So, but because that's what we know to do, we default to that's my thing about taken for granted ways of being. So I think we have to challenge ourselves a bit around that.
I
Absolutely.
agree. Always good to challenge yourself. Sorry, Anna.
Not at all. Carry on.
Thank you. Probably just got time for one more question,
Okay.
Deborah. So, this question's from John. How can we promote supervision to enable its recognition as more than just an add-on, but a recognised and valued fundamental role?
So this is where I think we should harness what our registrations say. We need to, go and have a little search around in your standards of proficiency of practice. Look at what your registration body says to employers. How it says, as the HCPC one happens to ping to my mind because I'm a speech and language therapist by background. But it talks about how, as employers, you will want to encourage and ensure that our registrants, who are your employees, can meet our standards. So I would go back and look at how those can support our thinking and our discussions with decision makers in that space. And again, back to the job planning idea.
Thank you, Deborah. That was absolutely wonderful, really informative and thought-provoking. We have a ream of questions, and may I be so cheeky as to ask whether you would try and answer some of them offline for us, and we can post the questions to the website. Would that be possible, please?
Yeah, it might not be today because I'm whizzing off to another conference this afternoon to present to MSK
Absolutely
Physio.
no rush. Absolutely no rush, but we'd be grateful if you would take your time to do that.
Of course.
Thank you so much once again for your time. It has been exceptional this morning.
And as I say, a real honour to be invited to join you.
Thank you so much for your time.